And as the strains of our theme song waft into the distance, welcome once again to FYI with Barry ZeVan. I am Barry ZeVan, big deal. And we're thrilled today to have a really big deal as our guest. She is Suzanne Amanor-Wilks, and she has quite a history. She is a neurodevelopmental movement specialist and MNRI specialist. She has 22 years of experience in education, Montessori, and neurodevelopment, and she also uh, earned her postgraduate in education from the University of London in the UK, and is also trained in brain gym, health, kinesiology, I'll get that right, touch for health, and much more. She also is responsible for bringing the Masgutova neurosensory motor reflex integration system to the area, the Twin Cities area, sponsoring Dr. Svetlana Masgutova and organizing the first Twin Cities Family Conference in 2009. Suzanne consults and lectures and has worked extensively with autism, ADHD, neurological challenges with the adopted child, and with many emotional behavioral challenges. And can't thank you enough, Suzanne, for being here. I've gotten to know you a little bit, and it's been wonderful.
Thank you, Barry. It's
You're welcome.
great to be here.
Great to have you. I'm fascinated by the incredible history you've had. You were born in Ghana, and where did it go from there?
I was born in Ghana at a time of decolonization of Africa, and Ghana was the first nation to fight the liberation struggle. So from there, we went to England. My father was British, so I was raised in England and educated in England, and then I came to America about 18, 19 years ago.
Goodness. How did you get interested in what you do? Because what you do is so helpful to so many people, and they don't realize it's really not an easy thing to do, what you do. So
Yeah.
perhaps
Well, as an MNRI course specialist, we work with children with diverse challenges, and it does look very, very easy. We train our parents. I am one of the team of instructors. We go around the world in the country training, and it does look easy. But you're right, it's actually very profound. That's one of Pamela Curley, who I think you had on the show. That's one of her favorite sayings, that simple is profound. The work is very complex. I think my life has probably been a little complex. I actually started off I was passionate about development, but at the macro level. So because of my whole background, right in the center of decolonization, Ghana it received independence or it fought for independence in 1957, and I grew up in that milieu. So development, my family is very much a family to do with development, and I studied international relations, and my first career I was supposed to be in diplomacy. I worked at the British Embassy, and how life loops around, I ended up in Saudi Arabia. I got married, and I had my own TV show there. And from there, I found out about Montessori education, ended back in London, and that's when I did my postgrad education at the Institute of Education, University of London, which brought me into the field of education, child development. I was invited to Minnesota to be part of the team of one of the very first schools that were the later models for the charter school system here. And there I was trained in many modalities, brain-based modalities for learning. And when I was completing my instructor training in Brain Gym, I met Pamela Curley, and she introduced me to the work of Dr. Masgutova. And I took my first training with Dr. Masgutova around 2003. And the moment I put my hands on the reflexes and felt them, I just knew that this was my life's work. And I've been doing it ever since.
Oh, that's wonderful. Yeah, thanks for mentioning Pamela, because she was the first guest on our first show.
Yes.
And she explained quite a bit about MNRI and what you do. What do you find, without damaging anything or anybody, but what do you find the most difficult challenge with which to work? Would it be PTSD, autism? What would you say?
I think probably, I actually really enjoy working with autism, but I think probably the most difficult challenge goes across the board when the child cannot control their movement and their behavior, whether it's an autism diagnosis, it could be possibly a cerebral palsy diagnosis, but when the reflexes are so disorganized, when there's been so great a trauma, it's like something just comes in and traumatizes the entire nervous system, and then the child can't control anything. And that's the most difficult when they're hitting and they don't want to be hitting, when they're aggressive and hurting, and that's not what they want, but they can't control their nervous system.
So you have a way to help control that, is that correct?
Yeah, the reflex work, as we have learned it, the Masgutova method of reflex work, which comes from the Russian lineage. It's very profound, it's very comprehensive. We are very, very fortunate to have Dr. Masgutova with us because she trained, her lineage goes all the way back to 1863, the father of neurophysiology, Sechenov, who said that every act of life, Barry, every act of life, whether conscious or unconscious, originates in reflexes. And the first time I heard that statement, it almost took my breath away. It's like every act of life originates in reflexes. If that's the case, then we can change every level of every act of life. So to me, that was just the most profound thing I'd ever heard. And then from Sechenov, her lineage comes down and ends with Vygotsky, who the world knows as, you know, one of the greatest psychologists who applied his work to child development and education. We learn him. He was like, his name was like, you know, you bow down to the earth at London University when his name was mentioned in the language department. So Dr. Masgutova, her lab in the science lab where she was dean of psychology in Moscow, she had access to his original materials in Russian. So the work we'd received from him in the West, obviously we hadn't received all of his work, and she had access to all of that work. So the profundity of the theoretical framework which underpins this work is what makes it so amazing, as well as the work itself. So the work itself is very global and very comprehensive. We have protocols probably for most things that go on in a human being, in the human physiology, movement. And
Has anybody ever asked you, I'm going to ask you now, but I don't know, the name Sigmund Freud comes to my mind, and I'm wondering, is there any correlation between Freud and what you do?
That's a great question, Barry. Thank you for that.
Thank you.
Because Sigmund Freud's work was all about unconscious processes and working in the unconscious. And when we say, because we get so excited and passionate about reflexes, and people are like, oh, you're over the top. But the thing with reflexes is they are housed in the same place where the unconscious processes are. So your heart rate, your breathing, your swallowing, all these unconscious processes that you don't determine breathe. Something in you breathes automatically, unconsciously. That's where the reflexes are, in the medulla of the brain. And so Sigmund Freud, he uncovered unconscious processes as they related to the psyche, to the psychological behaviors. Our work is equally exciting, and in my opinion even more exciting, because we go to the foundation of all processes, whether psychological, whether sensory, whether motor, behavioral, emotional, cognitive, our thinking, our abstraction, our perception, the way we perceive ourselves, the way we perceive others, the way we perceive the world. Everything is, the foundation of it is in the medulla, where these other functions are, and where the unconscious brain is really, all these processes are deeply generated from that place.
In the recesses of my brain, I recall it was either in grade school or high school where even our science teachers way back then, I'm talking in the 1940s, referenced the medulla and and so forth. I mean, it obviously did not go as deeply, even
Mm.
close to as deeply
Mm.
as what you do.
Mm.
But I think it's interesting to know that indeed, of course, it wasn't the 1800s as where this began, but even in the 1940s in this country, some of our science teachers were actually referencing what the brain does.
Mm.
And correct me, please, if I'm wrong, which I probably will be, what Dr. Masgutova has discovered or uses, and what you all use, it's the reflexes that tell the brain what to do rather than the brain telling the reflexes. Is that correct or is that wrong?
If you think of, I don't know if this will help, but like we've kind of got this whole computer age now, and we have the hardware and we have the software. So in terms of the nervous system, the hardware, which is like your computer and your keyboard, your output digitizer, that hardware would be the nerve net system, your brain cells, your neurons, and your sense organs where it outputs. And then the software is your operating system, your function, and the reflexes are your programs for the software for function. So if you think about reflexes, when you think of little babies, reflexes are coded in the they're in the genetic code. So they are these universal movements that all neurotypical babies do. So if you make a loud noise or voice, the baby startles. If you're abrupt when you're changing them, they go like this, or they can turn like this. You've seen the babies when you lean them forward and they start walking forward. So we all love to bounce them up and down, and their little knees just come up and down. Those are reflexes.
I'm sorry. I definitely don't want to interrupt, but I guess what I really meant was nerve endings. If the nerve endings dictate to the brain what to do rather than the brain telling the nerve endings what to do. Is that more correct?
Yeah, well, the brain is built through that neuron pathway, and it's sensory information. The signal that comes into the nerve ending is some kind of sensory information which the nerve ending draws in from the environment. So it could be visual, it could be a sound, often it's a touch. And when the brain receives that signal, then it draws it up and sends it along the pathways. So that's your sensory incoming signal, which is the beginning of the reflex circuit. The brain sends it through 5 levels of processing. So there's an internal genetically coded processor, which we don't exactly know. It's so complex, there's so many billions of neurons. And then what we do know is the output. So once those signals have been processed through 5 levels of the brain, from the medulla at the very bottom to the midbrain at the top of the brain stem, and then through the limbic area of the brain, through the thalamus, which is your relay, and then up there to your kind of mature executive brain. It goes through all of that, and then from there it outputs it back into one of those sensory organs, either your eye, your ear, your hand, your body, your legs, a muscle, and a muscle contracts, and that's where we see the motor output, the action, which is the reflex or the reflex pattern.
Is some of this...
Did that answer your question?
Yes. Very, very, very much, very much answered. Yes. Thank you, and thank goodness for your expertise. There's been a great deal. There are 2 subjects which have come to light quite a bit recently: concussions that football players and athletes suffer, and also autism. Can one trigger the other, or is autism strictly separate from concussions?
Gosh, I don't even know if I'd want to speak to that, because it's such a deeply, it is separate. Autism is separate from concussions.
Okay.
And the cause of autism is such a deeply researched issue right now. I don't think anyone really can come up with a definitive answer to that. There's a genetic component, there's an environmental component, there are there are sometimes triggers where the child wasn't on the spectrum, and then it develops. So it's so complex. Concussions are basically where there's some kind of damage, some kind of injury to an area in the brain.
Mm-hmm.
And so we have the effects of concussion, the nausea or the blacking out and so on. And then sometimes post-concussion, some of these sensory systems are affected. So the auditory system or the visual system, the thinking system. My son had 2 concussions. I have to share this story with you just recently. My son's he's a senior here in Minnesota, and he had a terrible concussion when he was a toddler. He was knocked through the head with a golf club by a neighbor kid by accident, and it left a big hole that I could put my finger all the way through his skull. And then he had another concussion, in elementary school playing hockey. And he came to me a week before his ACTs, for his college entrance. And he's like, Mom, can you help me? I was like, Steven, you left it a bit late. I've been asking you to come and do some work for a year now. So 3 days before the ACTs, now he had done tutoring all summer. And, they have these tutoring systems to try and get them up to get a good ACT score so they can get into a good school. And he just couldn't get past 25 with his ACT scores. So I said, okay, let's get on the table. He got on the massage table. I did 3 hours of work with him. I said, take a day off and then come back the night before the ACTs. So on Wednesday, I worked on him. Friday night, I worked on him for another 3 hours. Did tons of reflex work, did some processes. And he came home. He said, Mom, my brain was switched on. I was totally focused. And indeed, he went up 3 points. Now, his father had spent a lot of money with lots of programs, and they couldn't get him past that 25. In 3 days, he went up 3 points in his ACTs with Masgutova work.
Wow.
And this was just a couple months ago.
Congratulations. That's wonderful. Wonderful.
Yeah, so we have wonderful results with concussions. Wonderful. Yeah.
Now, PTSD obviously is top of mind for so many people these days, especially with service people returning from Afghanistan and the trauma of Iraq and just war. You've done quite a bit of work with that too. What is there? I don't want to use the word cure, but is there a way to alleviate the trauma to a degree where it doesn't result in panic attacks every day or every 2 hours or whatever it is? Is there a way to do that?
Yeah, trauma is such a deep manifestation that we're seeing all around us. Everywhere we turn in the world currently, this trauma, recent occurrences here in this nation and really all over the world. So trauma is sometimes an extreme activation of some of these unconscious processes which relate to fight, flight, freeze mechanisms in that medulla. And then when a severe trauma comes in, we went to Newtown and we helped with the school shootings there. We did a volunteer conference for the vets in Washington, D.C. We've been to Vietnam and helped out with the earthquakes there. Dr. Masgutova has been probably nearly every nation helping with trauma. So that's something that we are deeply committed to. And when you're working with trauma, you're working with emotional processes, you're working with perceptual processes where the perception may get stuck. So we keep seeing visually the trauma and we keep being re-traumatized internally. And then our perception may change, our perception of ourselves, our perception of others, and then in a traumatic trigger, suddenly the person who's with us becomes, if we were attacked, for example, by trauma. So trauma is very, very complex. We have a trauma protocol, a PTSD protocol, and we have deep processes. We've got a basal ganglia protocol. We've got a stress hormone protocol. So we can work very, very deeply with trauma to uncover some of the anchors that are keeping the trauma alive and where the trauma keeps looping around in the same area of the brain. Often basal ganglia is involved. And we can release that perception in the brain that the trauma is still occurring, because the brainstem has no time. It only has now. So even if the trauma occurred 5 years ago, as far as that brainstem is concerned, it's still occurring. So we we speak to that level of the brain and we say, dear unconscious processes, dear brainstem, you're not there anymore, you're here now. And we give it sensory information to show it where it is and bring that brainstem into present time. And we bring safety into the deepest level of the neurophysiology of that brain. And once the brain can receive the information that accompanies safety, which are reflexes, it can let go of danger. It can let go of the fight-flight responses. It can let go of the freeze mechanisms where we're just frozen, we don't function well anymore. And it's a question of degrees. You can go through an extreme trauma. You can go through nations being traumatized, like what we've seen. And you can go through minute amounts of trauma each day. So trauma is it has degrees. It's a continuum, and I think many of us are on that line. It's just we may be mild, or we may be, deeply traumatized.
I can't imagine how it must be for people who live in, say, Sudan or Syria or places where it's just constant from the time they're born almost, depending on the political climate or the whatever. Can those people ever be untraumatized?
I personally believe that there is nothing that cannot be addressed and released and developed from in the brain and in the experience, so long as one is willing to do that. And there are no quick fixes, for trauma. There can be. I mean, you can get. I've had clients. I've worked with populations who came from orphanages and were traumatized as infants, as babies, as children. Yes, you can get instant results where in 2 days the child is no longer fearful, and you can, or it can be years. In adults it tends to take longer because there's more layerings of experience. But I go to South Africa once a year, and Barry, you actually were greatly influential in opening up some introductions there for MNRI in South Africa, and we thank you for that.
Thank you.
And I've been training there, hospitals, and in Stellenbosch University. And my vision and MNRI vision is to take this work all over the world. And my personal vision is Africa, because I'm from Africa, and I feel that's where I want to take MNRI work to. So as far as Sudan, the Sudans, the Syrias, all the places of trauma that are everywhere, including here in America. It's not like it's over there. It's in our own backyard daily. We have a tool that can touch trauma at every level. It's just a question of working individually and working with specialists who can do that kind of work. But we can touch trauma, and we can walk the brain from a place of danger and survival and negative protection to a place of greater safety and support where the trauma can be released. We have in our book, we have this book. May I show it?
Sure.
Reflexes, Portal to Neurodevelopment and Learning. It gives a lot of our case studies and our studies into the work. And we have one of the parents from the Newtown, the Sandy Hook school shootings, where she lost her very young child, I think first grader child. And that mother, she gives her story, but she was able to move on from that trauma. And now she goes around and she talks to groups of people who are going through trauma. So she was able to release trauma, and we sent a team in, and we helped the survivors of that trauma. And they said it really helped. Our work really, really helped them. They were very appreciative.
That's wonderful. You've kind of already answered the question, but I'll ask again, maybe in a different way. You very wisely said that it's much more simple to work with children than adults, because adults already have all this floating around in our heads. But with the children, at what age do you start with them, or can you start with them, and at what age do you stop?
I'd say we can start at 0 with
Really?
preemies.
Wow.
And we can go past 99. The oldest person we've worked with is 99.
Oh my gosh.
So we can just keep going. I mean, neuroplasticity is ongoing. We're discovering that it goes right through. It slows down. We may not be as neuroplastic as we were at age 0 to 7, but we can still, our brains can still learn and relearn if we give them specific and adequate inputs. If we give patterns, sensory and motor patterns, we can keep developing, we can keep growing. I'm amazed by some of our specialists who are in their 70s. They get better and better in their function as they age. I mean, they're better today than they were 10 years ago in their functions.
So they learn along with the people they're helping. Is that correct?
Yeah, there's a beautiful mirroring mechanism. I mean, we're studying mirror neurons in the brain, and there's a mirror mechanism that occurs with this work where the person who's giving the work mirrors the person who's receiving the work. So it becomes a mutual process of growth and development. And our work, even though it is complex and even though it is very, very scientifically grounded, it can also be taught to anyone. Everyone can learn to do some level of this work.
Oh my goodness.
And we also have, for example, our archetype protocol can be done passively, it can also be done actively. So we have active movements that, for the elderly, for example, they can do these movements daily, and their function, it helps to maintain function. Because as you age, for the aging population, you want to keep your vestibular system healthy, because that's the foundation for your visual and your auditory. You want to keep your muscles going, like oiling up a car. So we have everything. We can work with every population.
That's wonderful. And we only have about 30 seconds here, but where would people get in touch to try to become a core specialist?
www.masgutovamethod.com lists all of our classes, and we have trainers who train. I'm a trainer. We have many, many trainers who go around the country and the world training, and you sign up for classes on the website if you're looking for a specialist. I'm very proud to say we have trained many, many people in Minnesota itself. And I also work here locally.
I can't thank you enough, Suzanne, for your great intelligence and insight and helping a lot of people. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Barry.
And we hope maybe this book might help you fall asleep. It's a cure for insomnia, by the way. It's my autobiography, Barry ZeVan, My Life Among the Giants, and available on Amazon. And learn a lot about this crazy television business and just a crazy life I've been blessed or cursed to have. Anyway, thank you so much once again to Suzanne Amanor-Wilks, and thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time right here on FYI with Barry ZeVan.